So as I mentioned earlier, confirmation is one of the more special times in the life of a congregation. It is a joy and a privilege to see young men and women willing to commit themselves to living a life of faith. And it is also a joy to see a congregation so willing to accept that and to walk beside them in that life. So these 4 young persons came to answer God's call. And over the course of the confirmation process, the many weeks that they met and prayed and studied, they discerned what that call was, and they discerned how they may answer it. Our God is a God who calls. If we look back through the Scriptures, we can find numerous examples of God calling individuals to different things and through different means. For example, we remember that God called Abraham to leave his family and his homeland and go to a land that God would show him later on. We remember that God called Moses to serve us as God's messenger and God's deliverer through a burning bush in the wilderness. Fast forward to the New Testament. We remember that Jesus calls Matthew by simply stopping by the table where Matthew was collecting taxes and using only 2 words, saying, "Follow me." And then we remember that Saul, who we know better as Paul, was traveling on a donkey when God knocked him off with a blinding light and called him to faith in and service of Jesus Christ. Our God is a God who calls. And this morning, it is the same God who called those persons. It is the same God who called young Samuel from our text today. It is the same God that calls us as well. My friends, you and I are called by God. The question is not whether or not we are called. The question is, will and how we respond to God's call. And I believe our text this morning gives us some insight into how we both hear and respond to God's call upon us. But first, again, a little background for what we've read. Eli and his sons were the house of the priests of Israel at the time. And Eli's sons went further than just being negligent of their duties. Eli's sons were absolute scoundrels. Their misdeeds included extortion, violence, and even some deeds that, if you go back to 1 Samuel chapter 2, would shock you. Deeds that I don't really want to mention in mixed company. These young men were not only failing their duties, but they were so grossly sinful that God rejected their entire family outright as priests. And this is a very dark time for Israel, because verse 1 of our text told us that the word of the Lord was rare. No one was hearing from God. Basically, the world was a dark place. And God seemed to be silent. Things were as bad as they seemed they could possibly get. And God didn't seem like he was doing a thing. That can sound familiar, can't it? We can identify with that from time to time. So Samuel's a young man, probably the same age as our confirmands this morning, when he's a priest in training under Eli. And as was common in those days, the apprentice stayed with the master and learned from him day and night. So one night, as Samuel and Eli are both lying down in their separate chambers to go to sleep, Samuel hears a voice calling him. Thinking it's Eli, he goes to Eli and says, "Here I am, you called me." Eli says, "I didn't call you, just go back to bed." Well, 3 times this happens before Eli realizes that not only was Samuel being called, but it was the Lord calling Samuel. So Eli instructs him, "Listen, this is the Lord calling. And if the Lord calls again, simply say, 'Speak, Lord, your servant is listening.'" And if we were to read further in the text, we would see that God calls Samuel to be a prophet, to replace the house of Eli, and to speak a desperately needed word from God to a people who felt like they were living in darkness. Samuel's call is a tremendous call. It's a unique call. But again, it teaches us much about how God calls and how we respond. So today I want to give you three things. Three things that show us from this passage how God calls us and how we respond. The first thing I see is that we don't have to have it all figured out before answering God's call. Look again at verse 7 from our text. Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. Samuel is young. Samuel is still in training. He doesn't know God, yet God knows him. That's a good lesson for each one of us. Do you remember the movie, The Count of Monte Cristo, when the young man tells the priest, I don't believe in God. And the priest says, it doesn't matter. God believes in you. It's easy to overcomplicate answering God's call. It's easy for us to think we have to achieve some level of enlightenment or training or spiritual nature, whatever it is. We think we have to have things figured out. When the truth of the matter is that answering the call of God is not about what we do or don't have figured out. It is simply about responding. This reminds me of when I answered God's call to me into a saving relationship, into a faith relationship with Jesus. I was in my junior year of high school. It was halfway through the year, and I was at a youth group lock-in. And I heard a voice call me, not audibly, but in my heart. I heard a voice call me. And it was simple. It was a lot like Matthew's call. Come and follow me. I really didn't know what I was getting myself into. I really didn't have many details. I simply knew it was a voice I didn't want to resist. And you know, after all of my years of ministry experience, after undergrad and a seminary degree, I still don't have it figured out. I'm still just doing my best each and every day to get up and answer the call. My prayer each morning is, God, I'm not sure what you want from me today, but whatever it is, just show me and help me do it. Answering the call of God upon your life is not about having it figured out. Now make no mistake, friends, God is calling you today. Whether God is calling you to a saving faith relationship in Jesus Christ for the first time, or if God is calling you to rekindle a faith relationship that has grown cold over time. Perhaps God is calling you into new areas of ministry, new ways to use your gifts for God's kingdom through the church. Or maybe God is simply calling you to deeper and more intimate levels of relationship. Whatever the case is, God is calling you today. And do not make the mistake of thinking you need to have things figured out before you answer God's call upon your life. The second thing I see is that God's call comes to us as individuals, but it is always confirmed in the context of community. Samuel had a call, but he could not discern nor answer that call properly until he had the counsel of Eli. The process of confirmation through which our students went affirms that the Christian faith is not a life meant to be lived in isolation, but is a call to a life of faith within the community of faith. Friends, this gathering, this body, is where we find encouragement. It's where we find support. It's where we find accountability. The dangers of going at the Christian life alone are very real, especially for those in Christian leadership. One has to only look at tragedies such as the Jonestown incident to see what can happen when a leader decides they will veer from the accountability and the structure of the life of faith. Our call from God comes to us as individuals, but is always to participate in community. We find that principle to be true in so many other areas of our life, and it is equally valid, if not more so, in the life of faith. Listen to what Jesus tells the church in Matthew chapter 16, verse 19. Jesus here gives the church its authority. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Now, many people have struggled with this passage over the years. Let me give you the theology of it in a nutshell. The church has real authority and real power. But that comes with a steep price. And here's what I mean. Think of times when the church has misused or abused its power and authority. What incredible damage has been done to individuals, to families, to whole nations when the church has failed to use its power and authority appropriately. Church, what we do, the way we live, has very real consequences. And we have a grave, God-given responsibility to use our authority, to use the power that we have in appropriate and life-giving ways. When the church lives into its responsibility, it is the most powerful and the most life-changing entity in the world today. The call of God comes to individuals, but it always leads those individuals to participate in the community of the life of faith. The third point that I see, God's call on you can accomplish things you never dreamed possible. I think we underestimate what God can do with us. We see things only in the short view. We don't realize the power. We don't realize the scope of what God can do with individuals like you and me when we answer God's call. Samuel had no idea. He had no idea where God was going to call him when he simply responded saying, "Here I am. Speak, I'm listening." You and I have no idea what God may accomplish through us simply saying, "Here I am." Now here's what we do. So I mentioned Samuel. Here's what it's easy to do. Those biblical figures, those characters, it's easy to forget that they're flesh and blood. That one day they were just like us. They feel more like, fantasy characters or figures from a fable long ago. So let me tell you a brief story about a flesh and blood person recently who answered God's call. Gamsa Agnes Bojaxiu was born on August 26, 1910 in Skopje, which is a city in the center of the Balkan Peninsula. Her father died when she was only 8, and this left her family in severe financial straits. They were in a very bad situation. And as Gamsa grew into a young woman in her teens, she began to realize God's call in her life. So she entered into full-time service of God as a nun. And when she did so, she moved to Ireland, where she taught at a school there for over 20 years. Well, being a woman of great faith and a woman of great prayer, in one of her prayer times, she heard Jesus call to her very, very specifically. And his call was, "Come, be my light." And then he told her he cannot go alone. Well, Gamsa, being poor and coming up in a very difficult circumstance, had a great passion and a great desire to see the poor and the outcast experience the love of God. She had a great desire to see those cast aside by society to find somewhere to belong, to find love and hope and acceptance. So after 2 years of prayer and consulting and discerning with other people of faith, she decided she would move to one of the poorest areas in the world and begin to simply show love and grace to the poor. So Gamsa moved to Calcutta, India, to care for those cast aside by the world and lived out most of her remaining years there. Now, you're probably thinking, well, I've never heard of Gamsa Agnes Bojaxiu. But you have. You just know her by another name. It's Mother Teresa. We never know the impact God can have on us. We never know what can happen when we are open and willing to respond to the call of God upon our lives. This morning, God is calling you. God is calling you to new and deeper places of faith. God is calling you to utilize your gifts and abilities for the kingdom of God so that others can experience God's love and God's grace. So my question this morning is, how is God calling you? Because our calls are different at different times in our lives. The calls may be different for different individuals. Just as our confirmands have answered the question, will you follow? Just as they have answered God's call in their lives by standing up in front of us and saying, here I am. I don't know what's next, but all I know is I want to answer. Will you follow their example? Will you answer the call of God upon your life today? I don't always do this, but Pastor Fran and I will be at the front like we always are. But there's a very specific invitation this morning. I would be remiss if I stood before you and asked you to answer God's call without giving you an opportunity to respond. Certainly, nothing is expected of anyone. But if you would like to respond to God's call in some way, your pastors will be right here to greet you. Because remember, our call is discovered and lived out with others alongside us. We'd be honored to take you by the hand and to pray with you. We'd be honored to put our arm around your shoulder and to say, yes, I believe God is calling you. So during our last song, we'll be down here. You're certainly welcome to come. You're also welcome to worship and to answer God's call right where you are in your pew. So I'm going to invite you to take your hymnals out. Our last song this morning, our song of response, will be Pass It On. It's number 572. We'll sing verses 1 and 3. And again, your pastors will be down front if you would like us to pray with you about anything, especially about responding to God's call and to help you say, here I am. Will you stand and worship with us?